Greg, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you, my friend.
Oh, my pleasure. You're welcome.
I'd like to begin talking about your career in law enforcement, your background. Tell me about that.
I actually started with Sheriff's Department in Orange County, California. And part of the program with the Sheriff's Department, after you go through the academy, you typically go into the jail system and you start to kind of get a little bit seasoned and accustomed to dealing with the criminal element in a controlled environment. So I worked in the jail for several years, and then I was always kind of, you know, attracted to the big city policing. And of course, we're right next door to Los Angeles. And so I applied for the LAPD, had to go through another academy. And then once graduating, I went to a really active patrol division called Newton Division in South Central Los Angeles and began to, learn about how to be a patrol officer. And I did relatively well. And so I quickly kind of was adopted into a gang unit we used to call Crash back in the 80s and 90s. It was a anti-gang unit. And I started to get to know, all of the working kind of mores and methods of gangs. And then I got into narcotics and began to work major narcotics, and then ultimately got into homicide and finished my career working out of our robbery homicide division in downtown LA.
How hard was it to work up the ranks? I know here in New York, the homicide divisions, whether you're in law enforcement or in a prosecutor's office, is kind of the cream of the crop. Is that the same on the West Coast?
Yeah, because of course the homicide um, responsibilities are as great as they can be in law enforcement. I mean, you're dealing with the loss of human life or the taking of human life. And so, you really need to be equipped to really do thorough investigations. And you learn that through the steps of doing lesser um, intense or lesser complicated investigations. So you kind of work your way up, but you do kind of, you got to kind of keep your nose clean, stay out of trouble, build a good reputation and get along with people and prove yourself to be, worthy of that position.
The LAPD in those years, bad reputation, very tough to kind of maneuver those elements. Was it difficult for you in dealing with those outside kind of influences?
Not really, because you just take it with a grain of salt. You understand that everything that you do has to do with conflict. That's the life of a police officer, is dealing with conflict. So you get accustomed to the idea of not being liked, being accused of things that you hadn't done, just out of the nature of opposing conflicts. And so you kind of take it with a grain of salt. However, there were times when the department really had done, people within the department had done horrible things that shed an unfavorable light upon all of us. That was the most difficult thing to do, to the most difficult storm to weather, is that when somebody else does something that reflects on all of you, that is a really, a difficult thing to accept and deal with.
How and under what circumstances were you assigned or did you join the multi-law enforcement task force that was assigned to investigate the deaths of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls?
Well, I've been actually working in those multi-agency configurations for the majority of my career. After I got out of patrol, I immediately went into, as I mentioned, an anti-gang unit. And then within that anti-gang unit, I was part of a multi-agency anti-gang task force. And then the same thing with narcotics. When I went to narcotics, I worked a multi-regional narcotics task force. So I was always working in these environments with different agencies, collaboratively trying to solve cases. And so when I got to invited, I guess recruited to work the Biggie and ultimately the Tupac case, it was because I had all that task force experience that I was one of the people selected, because we knew we needed a multi-agency perspective on that case.
And how did that process take shape in terms of what were the steps that you were assigned in the very, very beginning?
First of all, was just to get up to speed with all of the investigative material that was already in place, all of the previous investigation, and it was volumes. I mean, it took, a couple of months really just to digest all of the investigative work that had already been done, and then build a strategy on what to do that hasn't been done. And so it was a lot of sitting around and discussing and strategizing and putting together flow charts, and it was building a plan essentially.
Were the goals or the objectives of the task force to have somebody prosecuted, or was it simply to kind of shed light on what was something that nobody knew much about?
Well, of course, there was a lot of people who knew a lot about it. By the time I had gotten involved in the task force, nearly 10 years had gone by. So it was 2006. Tupac was killed in 1996, Biggie in 1997. So there was a lot of information, a lot of it erroneous, but a lot of information was floating around. The people thought they knew, what had happened, and had pretty good ideas and theories about what had taken place. And so we had to kind of, reinvestigate a lot of that and figure out, whether or not there was any validity to this multitude of claims. And of course, our responsibility, our goal is to always hold somebody responsible and to hold somebody accountable. And so that, that's the main goal, is like, let's bring this to justice and hold people responsible. So unfortunately, the lack of time, the passage of time worked against us.
Can you tell me a bit about the process, the evidence gathering process, information gathering process of what you went through, what your role and what the role of the task force in general kind of came out to be?
Well, keep in mind that, if we're talking about physical evidence, all of that was acquired, back at the scene at the time, and then anything that could be acquired after that. And it's just a methodical way of making sure there's a chain of evidence, making sure there's a way of tracking things, trying to keep things uncorrupted, so that they aren't brought into question later. But for testimonial evidence, that's really what we were after. We were looking for testimonial evidence, witnesses, people that knew things that had never come forward, in order to shed light on an old case.
And how did you go about finding, interviewing witnesses? Certainly, folks, I'm assuming would lawyer up, and obviously, unless you're under arrest, right, there's no compulsion. So it must have been difficult, especially given the passage of time.
Yeah, and in the nuance of the subculture we were dealing with, we knew we were dealing with gang members. We knew that oftentimes the associates of the victims were involved in a criminal element. And when you're doing that, you understand that they're not always the most cooperative and forthright people. And from their standpoint, it's justifiable. Nobody wants to be labeled a snitch, suffer the consequences of being, on the streets of LA and having a snitch package, on you. So, you have to deal with all of these obstacles. But, you're not dealing necessarily with the most forthright, honest people, either because they're afraid of testifying, or just because they don't necessarily respect the process of the criminal justice system. Many of them want to just take justice into their own hands. And that's exactly what we saw with the gang conflict that ensued after the murder of Tupac.
Tell me a bit about that.
After Tupac was murdered, Suge Knight immediately knew exactly who was responsible. He knew that the young man that had the young man that Tupac Shakur had sucker punched at the MGM was responsible for the murder, and his crew. And so they set about to seek revenge. And so a huge gang war started between Suge Knight's gang associates, the Mob Piru, and the associates of the young man that had been sucker punched. And he was a gang member named Orlando Anderson, and his crew, which were Southside Crips. And these guys already had historic opposition and conflict. And so it was just fueling a fire that it was already stoked.
Did you find that the high profile nature of this case, the actors involved, served as an impediment?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there were people out there, witnesses, that were really just grandstanding in order to bring attention to themselves. They just wanted to take the opportunity to get public attention, and they started to spew stories that were not necessarily reliable and accurate. And that always creates a problem because you start wasting time, investigating false leads. And so, we had to deal with that element. Um, so yeah, it was difficult for a lot of reasons.
In general, right? Being a homicide detective, you must have been a part of many high-profile investigations. Is it incredibly more difficult to navigate those waters if there's media attention, if there's press attention?
Well, there is absolutely, because the press, they just want to release information to the public, and oftentimes, and especially the press these days, don't care necessarily whether that information is reliable and accurate. They care whether it's sensational. And when you release information to the press, that can oftentimes work against the integrity of your investigation. You don't want to tip people off that maybe you have this particular lead, or maybe you're looking at this particular person. And so you have to really try to manage all of these loose ends. And the media oftentimes doesn't help, but oftentimes they do help. When you are at dead ends and you don't have leads, and you need to go to the media in order to get public attention, to get public interest, hoping that somebody will call up and provide some leading information. So it's always it's a real balancing act. And obviously the high profile cases are going to be the most difficult to manage.
Was there ever a thought of cooperating with federal authorities from other states? You were a multi-law enforcement task force, right? So I'm assuming that came into play.
Yes, absolutely. We were a federally, for lack of a better term, ordained task force. We had the FBI, the DEA, we had Customs, we had the United States Attorney's Office. Many of the elements of our task force were from federal agencies. So, and that provides a tremendous amount of resources. So we were really happy to collaborate on a large local and federal jurisdictional level.
There are always discussions about how difficult it is for these agencies to work together because you have to share information, and obviously folks want the praise and other such things. Is that something that you found in this case?
Well, there are, within the community of law enforcement, you obviously get your fair amount of egos. And unless you have a really well laid out and respected kind of chain of command, then things can get a little bit heated, and people start to march to the beat of their own drum, and it can start to work against itself as far as the efficiency of a task force. So, but as long as everybody respects, like, hey, he's the lead investigator, this is my job, it's to do this one thing, and I just need to focus on that, and then to collectively we bring all of that effectiveness together. And so it can be complicated, but personalities can also work for or against you. So it's just, you got to just manage each and every case with whatever it comes with.
What surprised you the most? What element was the one where you kind of would throw your hands up and say, oh, I never thought this would happen. I never thought this witness would talk to me. I never thought this agency would be as cooperative. Anything of that sort?
I don't know if I remember too many surprises in the case. We already knew that putting cases on people would compel them to cooperate. That's just a long-standing, reality in law enforcement. People, when they're faced with their own consequences, they are more likely to then be willing to talk to you in order, for self-preservation, so to speak. So those were no surprises. Getting people to talk really weren't surprises. Yeah, I don't recall anything actually being completely out of the blue.
Talked a second ago about the media, right? And how, again, particularly these days, right, there's this reputation that the media colors facts and kind of not fabricates stories, but reports on things in a disingenuous way. Is that something that in the mid 90s when this took place, and even in the mid 2000s when you were investigating. Is that something that played a huge role?
Well, certainly not so much then as it is now. A lot of media agencies these days, and especially with social media, nothing's vetted. They don't vet information. They just put out information. They do a calculated risk. Well, what's the chance of us saying this and getting sued? Well, there's a pretty good chance that we won't get sued. So if it's sensational and they feel newsworthy, they'll put it out regardless of the ramifications. And so this is, I don't think that media reporting is as responsible now as it was perhaps in the 60s and 70s and early 80s.
Do you think that the modification of the defamation laws would help, right? I mean, effectively, the idea is you can't sue anybody, right, if there's a falsehood about a noteworthy or public figure, unless there's malice, right? Unless there's intent, that somebody's reporting something with falsehood. Would that help law enforcement investigations?
Well, I'll tell you what it comes down to is money. And to sue somebody, you have to start out with money. And oftentimes the victims of defamation and slander and libel aren't in a position to even defend themselves, because you have to first start out with money in order to pursue these injustices. So that's one thing. And you're talking about perhaps going against huge media corporations that have multi-million-dollar lawyers on retainer all the time. So you have to really be practical about, like, yeah, this is terrible, it's wrong, but what can you really do about it in this day and age?
Right. Now, if I were to nail you down, which is impossible, in terms of the conclusions that were drawn from your investigation, which is at this point well over a decade old, what would those be?
Well, it's not hard to nail me down. I'm very resolute about it. I'm absolutely 100% positive that the individual that Tupac Shakur had sucker punched at the MGM prior to his murder, Orlando Anderson from the Southside Crips, along with members of his gang, sought and hunted down Tupac Shakur and shot and killed him. That's just that simple. That created a further intensity to the gang conflict that was already taking place. And Suge Knight decided to take it upon himself to retaliate for that act. Unfortunately, there was erroneous information, again from the media, that Biggie Smalls had been in Las Vegas at the time that Tupac was shot, that Biggie Smalls was the close associate of these Crip gang members that shot Tupac, and that Biggie Smalls had provided the gun that was used. That erroneous information is what got Biggie killed. That's why he was targeted. And so Suge Knight took it upon himself to hire his own hitman and retaliate for the murder.
And what were the details of that process?
The details of the process was that Suge Knight had reached out to a female confidant of his that actually was one of his baby mamas. And we refer to her as Teresa Swan. That's an alias for her real name. She then, because Suge Knight was in jail at the time this was happening, so she and Suge Knight's lawyer used the attorney-client privilege situation for her to be able to sit and talk to Suge Knight without being monitored by deputies, or she could speak with him confidentially, so to speak. He told her, go out, get a hold of this particular individual. He's a gang member named Wardell Faust. And I said, this is what I want done. Ask Wardell what he wants in return. An agreement was made. There was a transfer of money. And then Wardell Faust lied in wait for Biggie to leave the Peterson Automotive Museum. That's a mouthful. Peterson Automotive Museum, and pulled up alongside of him and shot and killed him. Both of these drive-by shootings were very, very similar in nature. The way Tupac was shot by a gang member is almost identical to the way that Biggie was shot by a gang member in Los Angeles. And this whole thing ultimately boiled down to gang activity.
What's interesting, and what a lot of people discuss surprisingly, is when Tupac was murdered, it's an unsolved crime, obviously, technically speaking, and this happens after a Mike Tyson fight in Las Vegas. Those two things are so inconsistent in the minds of folks because the amount of people here, the amount of attention is just unbelievable to think about, right? Law enforcement has solved crimes that seemed unsolvable, and this is just unbelievable to think about, really.
Yeah. Well, you've got to keep in mind, people have today the idea that there's just cameras everywhere and that there's communications that are readily available. And, we're talking about the mid 90s, and, they didn't have the number of, for instance, traffic cameras at intersections. And even if you look at that old grainy security camera footage of Tupac getting into the fight with Orlando Anderson, I mean, that's the highest quality system that was available at the time, and it's horrible. And that's at a major resort in Las Vegas. So, technology was not all that helpful back then. Fortunately, we did capture that fight on video. But the location where this took place was off the strip. It wasn't in this really crowded and congested area. It was off the strip. And they unfortunately encountered one another, and the Crips just took advantage of that opportunity and that timing. And Orlando Anderson took the gun that he had been provided and leaned out the window and started to shoot into the BMW, and ultimately fatal wounds hit Tupac.
In general, these days, right, when you talk about trials, conviction rates, or lack thereof, the idea, at least partially in my opinion, is that investigative techniques have been so advanced over time, right? Cell phones, cameras, listening devices, other devices that could pick up information that was impossible even 20 years ago, right? Is that something that you think plays a role?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. Today, license plates are getting caught on cameras all over the place. And that gets fed into, a general collective system where, nowadays I can go online and run a license plate as a private investigator and find out where that car's been all over the country, really. And those type of immediate resources weren't necessarily available back in the mid 90s. Of course, cell phone cameras, people's readiness to use them. Always, this shooting caught everybody off guard.
Right.
It just happened like that. Well, if this was today, there would have been cell phone cameras looking at different angles. Whether it was Biggie leaving the Peterson, or people on the strip seeing Tupac, all of that stuff really would have been much more likely captured, which would have provided some information and some clues. But ballistic investigations have improved. Different types of what we call covert investigations are more readily available. So there's a lot of things today that may have changed the outcome of that investigation back in the 90s.
Does that kind of thing make the job of law enforcement easier, quote unquote, or are there just different battles?
It's just different battles. We operated back then with a bit more liberty, a little bit more unrestrained. Nowadays, everything is, a plethora of paperwork and processes and approval type of. They inhibit you oftentimes, because in investigations, expediency oftentimes is really important. And when you're sitting and waiting for days for a warrant to be signed or to be approved, and you're losing evidence, that stuff can also be a hindrance. But it's just different today. I think the entire law enforcement culture is changing for the better, but it's just different times. The things that we did back then would never be tolerated today.
You mentioned that the environment's changing for the better. In what way?
Well, just that. I think cops are becoming much more equipped to be social agents. They're dealing with societal problems that aren't necessarily criminal. and and getting a better understanding of mental health issues, and looking at drugs not so much all the time as just this really is just a serious criminal action. And so, cops today are becoming more sensitized to cultural issues and learning how to deal better with those differences in different cultural climates. So I think the cops today are being better trained, better prepared to deal with conflict. Back in my day, conflict was dealt with typically just by a use of force. And nowadays they're learning how to better verbalize, de-escalate, and those type of things. But that also has its own consequences, because today cops are so apprehensive to use force when it's immediately needed and necessary. They make themselves vulnerable. I mean, the amount of cops being shot today, that's unprecedented. You look at how many cops have been shot in the last 5 years, and then you go back and look at how many cops were shot in this country in the 1990s. I mean, these numbers aren't even in the same ballpark, because cops today are a little bit more targeted. I think society's a little bit more reckless. And I think that cops nowadays are afraid to do the things they necessarily need to do to protect themselves, just because when they do use force, it's going to be micro scrutinized. And these things happen like this. This isn't where you sit around and think about this and then have a plan of action. This stuff unfolds in a matter of seconds at best. And so it's a tough game to be in today. I think it's really tough, but I also think that generationally, cops in the 70s were better than the 60s, the 80s, the 70s, the 90s, the 80s. I think they just keep improving and hoping to be able to become more efficient and effective in combating criminal activity and keeping the public safe.
Just generally, right? The idea is to strike a balance between individual rights, right? The preservation of individual rights. So police can't use force that's unnecessary, with the ability of police to maintain order. An incredibly delicate, difficult balance, I would imagine.
Yeah, and we're still figuring out how to improve that. It is, and I think it's always going to be. But until the public and law enforcement starts to collaborate better together, and all have the same ultimate goals and expectations, but it's a long and drawn out and difficult conversation for a lot of reasons.
Now, once your investigation was completed and you released a book about your investigation, how was that received by the law enforcement community and the general public?
Well, I think the general public, had a huge appetite for knowing what had happened. And even though there were theories out there, these theories were completely unsubstantiated. And so I think that the public wanted something that they could kind of sink their teeth in. They wanted something that felt true. And so I think it was very helpful to release all the information that we discovered in the investigation to the public by way of the book and afterwards the documentary. The department wasn't favorable to it. That's why I had to leave. I retired so that I could write the book, because otherwise it would have been a conflict of interest, because I'm technically talking about an unsolved case, and they don't look kindly on you going out and speaking publicly about unsolved cases. So there was some controversy about that, but at the same time, I think the department was very thankful that we were doing damage control against all these false allegations lodged at the department, claiming that they had been somehow involved or responsible for Biggie's murder. So we exonerated those false claims by proving what actually happened. So I think that it was bittersweet for the department.
Do you see anybody ever being held accountable for this or prosecuted? Obviously, it's been so many years, right? But you do hear cases once in a while where there's a cold case right after 20, 30, 40 years, a suspect is found somewhere. Certainly these days, the suspects are limited for a variety of reasons, right? Do you ever see that happening, ever?
I absolutely do not. I think Biggie Smalls the attorney representing the Biggie Smalls estate put it best. He says, these are not unsolved crimes. These are unprosecuted crimes. And I wholeheartedly agree. And I think it'll always remain that way. I am a little bit, I'm looking for the proper word, just bewildered that Las Vegas PD hasn't arrested Kading. I mean, he's out there on a variety of times. He's the individual that was in the white Cadillac along with his nephew, Orlando Anderson, who was the shooter of Tupac. Kading has publicly confessed to these murders, and we corroborated his confession. He's written a book about it. He's gone on podcasts, and he's brazen and braggart about it. And yet Las Vegas feels that his arrest is not necessary. Of course, his arrest would clear that crime. And regardless of whether you can successfully prosecute, that's just a different question. It's going to be hard to prosecute a guy just based on his own incriminating confession. Everybody else is dead. All the other witnesses and co-conspirators are dead. So you've got a situation where you can arrest this guy, clear the case, set history right, and whether he's successfully prosecuted or not is that has to be attempted regardless.
Do you think the reason, we both know, right, in order to prosecute somebody, prosecutors have to have a good faith belief they can convict beyond a reasonable doubt? Do you think maybe that's why they're not pursuing this?
Absolutely. You're 100%. It comes down to the probability of success. And that's a work theory. It's a business model that I don't agree with. I understand that you need to do that because you don't want to expend a lot of resources and money because you have a limited budget. So you go after the cases that you're confident that you can prove. And the ones that you don't think you can prove, you continue to try to work on and build them up to a point where you're confident. However, there are times when I think you just need to do the right thing for the right thing. And this is one of those times. Don't worry so much about whether you successfully prosecute him. Arrest him, clear the case, and set history straight so that in future generations, people can look back and go, there was closure in the murder of Tupac Shakur. There wasn't justice, but there was closure.
Now, what are you doing these days? I know you work as a private investigator. Tell me about your work.
So I do a variety of general investigations. I have my own company and I stay relatively busy, just, conducting investigations for both corporate and, personal entities. But really the thing I've got my teeth sunk into right now that I'm really, really trying to develop is the story of a guy named Christopher Dorner, who was a LAPD officer for a short period of time. He was terminated for a variety of reasons. And then he decided to retaliate against the department. He wrote a manifesto and then went on a killing spree for 10 days back in February of 2013. It was one of the biggest manhunts in California history. So he had gone out and killed several people, including 3 police officers, and shot a civilian female. And it's a really interesting story about, he saw the world through the prism of racism. And he thought that everything that happened to him was a result of systemic racism. And so he went out and decided to just kind of arbitrarily kill as many cops as he could. And he published a hit list of about 40 people that he was targeting. It's a very, very interesting case. And it was, for 10 days, Southern California was in a state of absolutely dread and fear. So I'm trying to get that story put together because I think it's relevant today as it was then. So that's what I'm working on now. So hopefully that'll come to fruition. It's a really interesting story.
Well, good luck with that. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Again, very much appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. And say hello to all your students for me.